My aunt kept asking when I was having kids, so I asked her when she was getting remarried. Aunt Linda started asking about kids the second I got engaged, which was honestly impressive because most people wait until you're actually married before they start harassing you about reproducing. Every single family gathering for 3 years became an interrogation, and I tried everything to get her to stop because I'm not a confrontational person, and I genuinely thought she would eventually take a hint. I gave her joke answers like, when the economy recovers, and when I finish my Pokemon collection, and she would just stare at me like I was speaking another language, and then ask the question again as if I hadn't responded at all. I tried being direct and saying, we're not ready yet, and she told me that nobody is ever ready, so that's not a real answer. I tried changing the subject, and she would circle back within 5 minutes. I even pulled her aside at my cousin's graduation party and told her privately that the question made me uncomfortable and asked her to please stop asking. And she patted my hand and said she was only asking because she cared about me, then asked again at the same party 2 hours later in front of my husband's parents. My husband and I had been trying for over a year at that point, and every negative test felt like a small funeral. But Aunt Linda didn't know that because it wasn't any of her business, and I shouldn't have had to explain my medical history to get basic respect. Christmas dinner that year started fine, and I genuinely thought we might get through one holiday without incident because Aunt Linda seemed distracted by the drama surrounding my cousin's new boyfriend who nobody liked. We made it all the way through the appetizers, and I was actually starting to relax when Aunt Linda looked across the table at me during the main course and said, so have you two made any decisions about starting a family yet? And I said, we're still figuring things out. She nodded like she understood, but then said, you know your eggs don't last forever. And my mom visibly winced from across the table. I said, I'm aware of how my own biology works, thank you. And she said she was just trying to help because she didn't want me to have regrets. And I said, I appreciate your concern, but we have it handled. She was quiet for a few minutes, and I thought maybe that was the end of it. But then she turned to my mother and said, did you talk to her about the fertility specialist I mentioned? And my mom said, Linda, drop it. And Aunt Linda said, I'm just saying there are options if something is wrong, loud enough for the entire table to hear. My face was burning and I said, nothing is wrong, we're just not ready. And she said, that's what my friend Dorothy said, and now she's 53 with 4 cats and cries at baby showers. And at this point, the entire table had gone quiet. My husband put his hand on my knee under the table, which was his signal that I should let it go. But Aunt Linda wasn't finished because she looked at him and said, maybe if you tried a little harder, she wouldn't be so stressed about it. And something inside me just completely disconnected from the part of my brain that cares about family harmony. I set my fork down very carefully and looked directly at Aunt Linda and said, speaking of trying harder, when are you planning to remarry? Her face went completely pale and she said, excuse me? Aunt Linda had gone through an especially messy divorce, and everyone in our family knew not to bring it up to her or talk about it. I knew I was crossing a line, but 3 years of swallowing my feelings had finally caught up with me, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I said, I'm just asking because you've been divorced for 6 years now, and I worry about you being alone, and I just don't want you to end up with regrets. She stared at me like I had just slapped her across the face and said, that is none of your business. And I said, you see how rude it is when someone asks personal questions that are none of their business? And she opened her mouth to respond, and then closed it again because there was absolutely nothing she could say. My grandmother cleared her throat and said, Linda, pass the gravy, and we finished the rest of Christmas dinner in the most beautiful silence I have ever experienced.